Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be learning about the linear search in Java. Now, searching is basically when you check if a certain value exists in an array. For example, if you look at this array, 5, 9, 2, 6 and 8, below them I have a variable called target which is set to 6. And target is the variable I'm searching for. I want to see if this value 6 exists in the array. Using a searching program, I will iterate this array and check if this value exists. If it does exist, I'll probably tell the user that this value is present in the array. If it doesn't, well then I'll tell the user that it doesn't exist in the array. Now a linear search is actually incredibly simple and you can probably write the program yourself because all a linear search is an iteration of the array with an extra condition. Now to understand this, let's just take the same array. It has 5 elements. 5, 9, 2, 6 and 8. I made an iterator called I which is initially set to 0 and on the bottom right I have a condition which is checking if a of I is equal to target. Basically each iteration it's going to check if that element of the array is equal to the element that we're searching for. And that's the whole point of the program, because if they're equal, that means that the value that I'm searching for does in fact exist in the array. So I could probably print that the value exists. And if it doesn't exist, we'll print that the value doesn't exist. Now on the bottom left, I have a counter variable. And all this counter variable does is it helps us in determining whether a value exists or doesn't exist in the array. And you'll understand how it does that as we iterate this array. So our I is initially set to 0. So we're going to check if a of 0 is equal to the target value that I'm searching for. For now, we'll assume that the target value that I'm searching for is 6. Over here, 5 is not equal to 6. This is false, so our count variable is going to stay as it is. Our I is going to increment by 1. And now we're going to check if a of 1 is equal to target. Basically, if 9 is equal to 6. This is also false, so our count will stay as it is. I increments to 2. And now we're going to check if a of 2 is equal to the target value. 2 is not equal to 6, so the condition is false and therefore count will stay as it is. Our I increments to 3 and now we're just checking if 6 is equal to 6. Since this is true, we've found our value. And to know that we found our value, we're going to increment count by 1. Basically, depending on the value of count, I can know whether a value was found in the array or whether it wasn't. And you'll understand why at the end of this iteration. So our I finally increments to 4 and we're going to check if a of 4 is equal to target. This is false, so our count will stay as it is. Now what if a value wasn't found in an array? Well, let's assume this array. It's the same array, but now I'm searching if the value 3 exists in the array. When we start the iteration, we're going to check if a of 0, which is 5, equal to target. Target is 3. Since this condition is false, our count is going to stay as it is. I increments to 1 and now we're going to check if a of 1 is equal to target. Basically, if 9 is equal to 3. The condition is again false, so our count stays as it is. Our I increments to 2 and now we're going to check if a of 2 is equal to target. 2 is not equal to 3. This is false, so our count stays as it is. Our I increments to 3. Again the condition is false, our count does not increment. Our I changes to 4. Again the condition is false, so our count ends up as 0. And you can clearly see the difference. When we found the value in the array, since we increment count, the value of count is greater than 0. When we haven't found the value, our count ends up as 0. So after we complete the iteration, using the count variable, we can tell the user whether we found the value or not. Now let's look at the actual program to implement the linear search in Java. But before we write the program, we'll look at these 6 steps, which describes exactly what a linear search should do. Now the first thing we're going to do is take the target value that we're searching for as input from the user, because the user is the person who wants to check if some value exists in the array. So once we take the target value as input, we're going to initialize the count variable. We're just going to set it to 0. And then we're going to iterate the array. And we already learned about array iteration. So we're going to check if a of I is equal to the target value we're searching for. If this is true, we're just going to increment count. This is exactly what we've seen. And in the end, if my count ends up as 0, we're going to print that the value wasn't found because the value wasn't found. But if count is greater than 0, then we're going to print that the value was found. And this is pretty simple to implement. Now, I already created this array over here called A, and I added 5 values: 4, 7, 8, 1, and 33. I created a scanner class object called SA, and I'm going to use it to take an input from the user. So let's add a println statement asking the user to enter a value. Once we do this, we're going to take this value as input and we're going to store it in some variable. Let's just call it variable target. So we're going to say int target is equal to sa.nextInt. Now we need to initialize our count variable. So we'll just say int count is equal to 0. So now we're going to do our third step, which is we're going to iterate the array. So we're going to do that using a for loop. So we're just going to say for int I is equal to 0. And our condition is going to be I is lesser than 5 because 5 is the length of the array. And we're just going to increment I by 1, I plus plus. As we iterate this array, we're going to check if a of I is equal to the target value that we're searching for. If this is true, we're going to increment the count variable. To do this, we're going to use an if statement. So if a of I, which is the current value during that iteration, is equal to the target value that we're searching for, then we're going to increment the count variable by 1. That's pretty simple to understand. In our next step, we basically check if our count is equal to 0. If this is true, we print that the value wasn't found. If count is greater than 0, we're going to print that the value was found. And to do this, we're going to use if statements. So basically, we're just going to say if count is equal to 0, if this is true, we're going to print that the value wasn't found. On the other hand, if count is greater than 0, we're going to print that the value was found. And that's it. We've written our program over here. All it's doing is that it's iterating the array. If the value is found, it's incrementing a variable by 1. If that variable ends up as 0, it means that the value wasn't found. So we just tell the user that the value wasn't found. But if that variable ends up as a value greater than 0, it means that the value was found. So we basically tell the user that the value was found in the array. Now let's just run this program. So when I run this program, it asks me to enter a value to search for. So I'm just going to enter a value that I know exists in the array. So we know that 1 is a value that exists in the array. So let's just enter 1. And you can see that it tells me that the value was found in the array. We'll run this program one more time, but now we'll enter something like 50. We know that this value does not exist in the array. So if the program works well, it needs to tell me that the value doesn't exist. And when I click enter, it does tell me that the value wasn't found in the array. Our program works perfectly well. Now, when we iterate the array, we see that when we find the value, our count increments by 1. So a question you might have is, if count increments by 1, why are we checking if count is greater than 0? We could instead check if count is equal to 1. To understand why that is, we're going to take a look at this array. Here, we can see that an element repeats twice. The value 2 is present both in index 1 and index 2. And we're checking if the value 2 exists in the array. When I start the iteration, we're going to check if a of I, basically if a of 0, is equal to target. This is false, so our count stays as it is. Our I increments to 1, and our count is also going to increment to 1 because a of 1 is equal to 2. Next, this is going to increment again. Our condition is again true, so our count again increments by 1. Our I changes to 3, the condition is false, so our count stays as it is. I increments to 4, condition is false, so our count variable stays as it is. So you can see that our count variable doesn't always end up as 1. It could be 3, it could be 4, it could be any value greater than 0. Therefore, it's always better to check if count is greater than 0. As a bonus, it could also help us know the number of occurrences of the target value in the array. Over here, since the value of count is 2, we know that the target value 2 is present 2 times in the array. And that's it. That's all you need to know about the linear search in Java. Thank you for watching and have a great day.